In Luke chapter 21, verse 28, by the way, we're continuing with the pre-tribulation rapture information. And in Luke chapter 21, verse 28, Jesus said, when these things, that's the signs, begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. He didn't say, after all these things have happened, your redemption draweth nigh. He said, when these things happen, begin to come to pass, it is close. In the Old Testament, there were two different pictures painted of the Messiah. One of suffering in Isaiah 53, verses 2 through 10, and Psalms chapter 22, verses 6 through 8, and 11 through 18. There was one suffering and one reigning as king. As we look back on these scriptures, we see they predicted two separate comings of the Messiah. The first coming as a suffering Messiah, and the second coming, which is still future, as a reigning king. In the New Testament, we have two pictures painted. These two different descriptions of Jesus coming point to two separate events we call the rapture, or being caught up, and the second coming. In Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 through 15, doesn't mention a resurrection. This is an Old Testament picture of Jesus returning to earth at the second coming. Again, there is no mention of a resurrection. Concerning the return of Jesus, the Bible presents a day we can't know and a day we can know. Matthew chapter 25, verse 13 tells us that Jesus will return at an unknown time, while Revelation chapter 12, verse 6 says the Jews will have to wait 1,260 days for the Lord to return. The 1,260 days begins when the Antichrist stands in the temple and declares himself to be God. That's in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. And then that begins the Great Tribulation, where there's more troubles upon the world than ever have been or ever will be. And we see all that in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 21, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. And that event will take place at the midpoint, as I said before, of the 7-year tribulation, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. The Antichrist has authority to rule for 42 months, which is 1,260 days. According to Revelation chapter 13, verse 4, and will be destroyed by Jesus at his second coming. And that's in Revelation chapter 19, verse 20, and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 8. The known and unknown days must happen at different times, meaning they are two separate events. The door in heaven is open to let John into heaven. John's call into heaven is prophetic of the church being called up at the rapture. In Revelation chapter 19, verse 11, heaven is opened again, this time to let the armies which are already in heaven out. This is the church which has been raptured or called up at the previous time, following Jesus out of heaven at the second coming. Come up here, it says in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1. A voice called for the apostle John to come up here, and immediately he was in heaven. This could be a prophetic reference to the rapture of the church. The words come up here are spoken to the two witnesses who are killed in the middle of the tribulation, who are resurrected and ascend to heaven, in Revelation chapter 11, verse 12. Therefore, the phrase come up here could mean the church is raptured in Revelation chapter 4, verse 1. The word church is mentioned 22 times in Revelations, in Revelation chapters 1 through 3, but it is not mentioned again until Revelation chapter 22, verse 17. After John is called up into heaven, the 24 elders with their crowns, he sees the 24 elders with their crowns in Revelation chapter 4, verses 4 through 10. We know that Christians will receive their rewards or their crowns at the rapture and the bema seat of Christ, the judgment seat of Christ, according to 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, and 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4. We will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous, according to Luke chapter 14, verse 14. And the elders couldn't receive their crowns unless the resurrection, the rapture, has already taken place. Holy ones are ready with Jesus in heaven, according to Zechariah 14, verse 5, and Revelation 19, verse 14. The armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, follow Jesus out of heaven on white horses at his second coming. And that's Revelation chapter 19, verse 14, Zechariah chapter 14, verse 5, and Colossians chapter 3, verse 4. These are not angels, because Revelation chapter Revelation chapter 19, verse 8 tells us the fine linen is the righteousness of the saints. In order to come out of heaven, we first have to go in, indicating a previous rapture or being caught up. The hour of testing, which Revelation chapter 3, verse 10 says we will be kept out of, says that we will be kept out of the tribulation. Some have wrongly believed keep means to keep through or protect through the tribulation. Suppose you approach a high voltage area with a sign that says keep out. Does that mean you can enter and be protected? No. It means you are forbidden from entering the area. But this verse also says he will keep us from the hour of testing. It is not just the testing, but the time period. If a student is excused from a test, he will still has to sit in the class while others take the test. But if he is excused from the hour of testing, he can go home. The church will be called home before the hour of testing. Jesus said he would prepare a place for the church in heaven, and then he would come again to receive us to himself. Why would Jesus prepare a place for us in heaven and then not take us there? At the rapture, he would come to receive us to himself. That is where I am, heaven. There you may be also. If the rapture occurred at the same time as the second coming, as some folks think, we would go up into the clouds and then immediately come back to earth. That would contradict John chapter 14, verses 2 through 3. When Jesus returns to the earth at his second coming, he will return from a wedding. And we see that in Luke chapter 12, verse 36. At the rapture, Jesus is married to his bride, the church. After the wedding, he will return to earth. When the angels are sent forth to gather the elect at the second coming, mentioned in Matthew chapter 24, verses 29 through 31, some have wrongly interpreted this as the rapture. This is a big problem with this interpretation. Excuse me. If we are resurrected at this time, why would we need angels to gather us? In the resurrection, we will be like the angels, according to Matthew chapter 22, verse 30, able to travel in the air at will. Obviously, these people who are gathered are not resurrected. Therefore, it can't be the rapture. No one would claim the wicked are raptured at this time, yet Matthew chapter 13, verses 39 through 41 and verse 49 says the angels will not only gather the elect, but also the wicked. This gathering is not a resurrection. In the catching up or the rapture, they're caught up at the blink of an eye to be with Christ in the air. And at the second coming, the angels gather them. So it's two different events. Jesus said he would prepare a place for the church in heaven, and then he would come again to receive us unto himself. Why would Jesus prepare a place for us in heaven and then not take us there? At the rapture, he will come to receive us to himself. That is, Where I am, which is in heaven, there you may be also. If the rapture occurred at the same time as the second coming, as some folks think, we would go up into the clouds and then immediately come back to earth, and that would contradict, again, John chapter 14, verses 2 and 3. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, Paul says, the one who restrains will be taken out of the way before the Antichrist can be revealed. This refers to the rapture because the church is clearly the biggest obstacle to the Antichrist becoming a world ruler. If the rapture occurred at the second coming, as some believe, why would the sheep and goats need to be separated immediately after the second coming? The rapture at the second coming would have already separated the sheep and goats. With the pre-tribulation rapture, the people saved after the rapture will need to be separated after the second coming. If the rapture occurs at the second coming and the wicked are cast into hell at the time, who will be left to populate the millennium? Only people in their natural, non-resurrected bodies will be able to have children. In Matthew chapter 22, verse 30. With a pre-tribulation rapture, the people saved after the rapture, who are alive at the second coming, will populate the earth during the millennium. So the rapture is a resurrection of those in Christ. And you find that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. Isn't it a little bit odd that in Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 through 12, which is the clearest picture of the second coming of Christ, and there is no mention of a resurrection? The rapture will be the biggest event since the resurrection of Jesus, where hundreds of millions of Christians will be resurrected and translated, yet there isn't any mention here. Don't you think it deserves at least one verse? The rapture isn't mentioned because it doesn't happen at the second coming. Thank you for listening.